everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm officially stopping trying to count them. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to do something a little different than what we've been doing.
Well, we're going to be talking about a specific person instead of like a franchise or a character.
Right, we're going for a creator in this one, and we wanted to pick something relevant, so we went with a guy who had the most popularity in the 90s.
Even now he has a lot of popularity, but it's waned.
But he does have a new film coming out. This is going to be a podcast about Quentin Tarantino.
The infamous grindcore Oscar-winning director.
Oh, that'd be a good headline. We should have made this an article. So we'll start with the most basic information we could. Quentin Tarantino was born on March 27th, 1963. He was born in Tennessee, but by his teenage years was living in Torrance, California.
Yes, which is a subsidiary, politely, of Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is just basically almost all of South California, except for San Diego.
Yeah, if you've ever been down there, you realize, like, L.A. County, it just feels like it goes on forever.
Yeah. After living there, it's just hours and hours of driving, he's still not out of L.A. So as a teenager living in L.A., he worked at the Pussycat Theater, which was a chain of pornography theaters, which is kind of a phenomenon you don't see anymore.
Yeah, and
at the internet.
At the time, it was kind of a big deal. There was a lot of controversy surrounding it. But these theaters, along with pornographic films, would play sort of exploitation films too. And that influence is pretty evident in a lot of his work. It wouldn't be long after that, though, that he started working at LA's Video Archive, and that's become kind of this big thing everyone always talks about with Quentin Tarantino, that, he started out in a video store and then he sold his script. It's a little more complicated than that.
It's kind of like, well, it's in the name, it's a video archive. These studios would literally store their movies there. So you would kind of help them fetch like reels and even videotapes and things like that. But he famously just kind of sat around all day watching movies because there was kind of nothing else to do.
Yeah, and it would be more of, if someone was doing research for a film, they might come in and ask for a videotape, and that would be more of his job. Or they might ask for a suggestion in a style of film, and they were pretty good at doing that.
Yeah, because even back then, Tarantino was a film connoisseur. He would spend his entire teenage years watching films every single day, every kind of film too.
So that leads to Tarantino eventually making his own short film called My Best Friend's Birthday. We don't really need to get into that, I don't think. No, it's just sort of his first relevant work, I guess.
It's kind of been lost to history, kind of swallowed up by his bigger works that are far more of his style. We'll get into what kind of defines him as a director in a little bit, but this was an early work. Most people's early works are not that indicative of what they become later on.
I would agree with that. I think the key year, and everyone is going to say 94, but if you kind of look at the real history of what was going on, probably the biggest year in Quentin Tarantino's life up to that point was 1990. He and Avery had written a script at the time that was called Open Road. It eventually would transform into True Romance, Natural Born Killers, and parts of Pulp Fiction from what I was able to read. I think that would be sort of your flashpoint for where his career really takes off.
Well, that's his foot into the door, I would say. We'll get a bit more into the history of the film industry at this time later on, but Open Road was what got him noticed by people.
So, now he's gotten this script sold. He begins his, I believe, still existing production company, A Band Apart, which would later feature many, many directors. Now that he's established his production company, he's going to move towards Reservoir Dogs.
Which is the breakout. Not the commercial breakout, but at least his other breakout in Hollywood. If Open Road is his foot in, Reservoir Dogs is what really defines him as an up-and-coming director, as somebody to be looked at, somebody that should be followed and given money to. Because Reservoir Dogs at the time, he wanted to only make it on a $30,000 budget, but over time, he was able to get with Harvey Keitel, and he helped raise it to $1.5 million, which even in the 90s, that's not a whole lot for a movie.
Yeah, there was some indication from what I read, too, that there might have even been a little more money getting thrown around. He did go to New York to cast, which is where he would pick up Steve Buscemi, a couple other actors for the production.
Yeah, even at this point, he was kind of famous for certain casting choices, at this point would pick up kind of washed up actors or even actors that were on the rise. That's not so true anymore just because he's so big, but for most of the 90s, he's known for kind of picking up these people that weren't that popular and kind of reinvigorating their career.
In 1993, Tony Scott, who probably most famously directed Top Gun, he ends up directing what Open Road initially becomes, which is True Romance. Tarantino was extremely excited about this. Tony Scott had done a lesser-known film named Revenge that I could not recommend more. It's a great movie. And Tarantino basically walked around apparently telling his friends that the guy who made Revenge was going to make his movie. And he was super, super pumped. And of course, they end up having a pretty good relationship, and that's going to pop up in a later point in Tarantino's career. We're going to get to that too. The next big release for Tarantino is something that is wrapped in a little bit of controversy. That would be Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers.
This is kind of like, there was a lot of hands on the script, and it's kind of morphed over time, especially from what Tarantino sold it as. That's kind of like the natural progression for scripts now, but back then it was kind of, you weren't supposed to really like shred a script like that.
And also I think just for, even at that point, who Tarantino was becoming, if you're going to put his name on it, it was implying this sort of indie, like, pulled himself up by his bootstraps type production, and Natural Born Killers isn't.
Yeah, no, it's made by like a big Hollywood director, Oliver Stone, famously. We'll get a bit more into the culture later on because there's a whole compounding thing with Tarantino's career throughout the whole 90s.
Yeah, we're trying to break this into sort of chunks because things do change, but I think what's important when we're talking about Natural Born Killers is there are two big points that come out of this that end up the points of contention about the film. First, there was a really big dispute about the publication of the Tarantino script. Essentially, the studio had told Tarantino at a certain point that, no, you cannot publish your version of the script because we basically bought that from you. And Tarantino was making a lot of money on the published scripts for Reservoir Dogs and True Romance. So it was a big shot to him. And think of it this way, like, there is no Pulp Fiction yet. So he's still trying to take what he's made and make the most money he can out of it, and he's still trying to get his own productions off the ground.
He's trying to be taken seriously. Right now he's kind of seen as like an auteur, but not in the sense of like what he is known as today, as like a genius filmmaker.
Right, he would be someone who would be of great interest to another filmmaker, and which is why you would want to publish something like a script, where that might not be, the concern of a Spielberg production. But to him, this is a very important element. So there's that dispute. He does eventually get his version of the script published.
Which back then, like as you mentioned earlier, is a big deal because instead of being able to read scripts online, you had to actually go out and buy them. And with the success of Reservoir Dogs and True Romance, people were buying the scripts and like flipping through them because he has such a style even in his scripts.
And the other side of this is there were numerous rewrites before Stone even got the script. Stone's version of the film was something that Tarantino, though optimistic at first, I was reading old interviews, he didn't have too much of a problem with Stone taking the film. He just was incredibly frustrated by the product that eventually came out. He felt that it didn't have the sort of, I don't want to say moral, if you've seen the film, but the sort of emotional core that was supposed to be there, he felt sort of was torn out and made this sort of film that glorified violence for no other reason than to glorify violence.
I mean, that's funny, Tarantino saying that.
We can get back to that, though. It is in many ways similar to the way Stephen King looks at Kubrick's version of The Shining.
Yeah, he's walked back a bit on it, but generally the way King looks at that is like, this is nothing like the original book. It focuses on an entirely different thing than what I made. And
it also tears out the heart of kind of the Shining novel where, Jack, you kind of understand by the end, wasn't evil.
The book is a lot more about like family and things like that and like the madness of writing. And there is more about like the movie is more about isolation.
By the time Natural Born Killers does come out in August of 1994, Pulp Fiction has already debuted at cons. That was back in May of 1994. It's generating a lot of buzz, And I have to assume that's part of the reason that Tarantino was also trying to make his opinions of Natural Born Killers very clear. Natural Born Killers is beating Pulp Fiction to theaters by about 2 months. And so in October of 1994, Pulp Fiction does come out. Story credit also goes to Roger Avary again, probably in large part because of the sections that seem to be derived from that original Open Road script in 1990. Obviously, Pulp Fiction is huge. It not only reinvigorates the career of John Travolta, but I think most firmly established the aesthetic that Tarantino would come to be known for.
It kind of changes film itself because the way it comes out, it was like, we didn't really see films like Pulp Fiction where it was kind of like a vignette, especially at this high budget level. And ever since then, people were kind of emulating that movie throughout the whole 90s. Like that kind of like raw, people just kind of killing each other. Betrayals, the cut to black was infamously copied by like every small movie in the 90s.
And, a lot of that certainly comes from that sort of grindhouse exploitation background that Tarantino has. Tarantino here shows that sort of postmodern mentality towards film where you're not only looking at what story you're trying to tell, you're looking at how you're telling it, and you're looking at how the most common ways of telling it have affected the viewer.
I'll get into what I kind of think of him later on, but moving on, we're kind of coming up at the end of like his first era.
Yeah, in 1995 we have 4 rooms, a film split between 4 directors into 4 segments. Tarantino has a segment. A lot of people kind of breeze over this, and we're going to.
Yeah, because more famously he was working on Dusk Till Dawn, which is kind of his bigger grindhouse film.
Yeah, From Dusk Till Dawn is interesting too. And there's something, we're going to jump back. Before we kind of mentioned that 1990 might be the most pivotal year in his career in reality, at least as far as setting things in motion. Back in 1990, he gets approached by Robert Kurtzman from K&B Effects. And in 1996, they released From Dusk Till Dawn, which was almost another one of the Tales from the Crypt films. It would have followed Demon Knight with a story about stripper vampires, which is funny because the movie that does follow Demon Knight is called Bordello of Blood. So From Dusk Till Dawn is interesting. You can see the writing influence of Tarantino on it immediately, basically because the opening act of it is a Tarantino movie. It's basically a crime movie until they get to the vampire strippers.
Yeah, which seems much more Rodriguez.
Yeah, and I think it is much more Rodriguez. Even if you watch the way the film is shot, I'm not convinced that Tarantino wasn't directing some of the earlier scenes in that movie.
Well, he definitely directed the foot scene.
Oh, probably. It's sort of a taste of things to come, where it really does feel like this real deliberate split between Rodriguez and Tarantino, where they're both working on the same project, but you feel like you can see exactly where that line is. Also, first major motion picture for George Clooney.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. That was his first big budget motion picture.
For General Hospital.
Not General, ER.
ER?
Oh, people are going to get mad, man.
Oh, I'm sure.
So 1996, we have From Dusk Till Dawn. Well received. It's a cool movie if you haven't seen it.
It's a bit more niche. It doesn't kind of get recognized by the critical upper class at this point.
Yeah, and I also think a lot of people dismiss it because it's not a pure Tarantino film.
Yeah.
But if you watch it, it's pretty close to a pure Tarantino film until you get to the second half.
Where it's all blood and guts, which is obviously Rodriguez after all his weird low budget special effects stuff.
Finally getting a little bit of a punch behind that. And the last sort of film of this era is Jackie Brown. Based on Elmore Leonard's Rum Punch. Tarantino was a huge Elmore Leonard fan. Elmore Leonard, probably best known otherwise for Get Shorty, which was also turned into a film, which also featured John Travolta, which I thought was interesting. But it shows the era. It shows that was the direction things were going.
Yeah, especially with Tarantino, he's very much a Hollywood person. He likes making all these weird connections, especially in his filmography. But after Jackie Brown, which gets kind of backlash, it was a bit controversial in its time for multiple reasons, but we won't really get into that.
Yeah, Jackie Brown, could I be completely up for this? Is my favorite Tarantino film.
Oh, really?
I love Jackie Brown. I feel like it's him finally slowing down a little bit and kind of looking back at what he did and trying to tweak it a little more. We've gotten through what a lot of people consider to be the definitive era of Tarantino. I think that sort of Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown is that base where he's now moved on. He is edgy in those, but at this point you can't deny neither his popularity nor his ability.
Yeah, because before, like, even with Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, he was kind of seen as a one-hit wonder. This has a lot to do with the era, which we're going to get into now, because after Jackie Brown, he takes like a 6-year break.
Yeah, there's a big gap in film, but you have to look back now at sort of the effect Tarantino had during that time. Reservoir Dogs being the type of success it was, even though it's not this blockbuster movie, the fact that you could make a movie for that little amount of money and get that much attention has a huge impact.
Yeah, well, this has to do also with like Clerks coming out this era. This is kind of the early videotape era of film, whereas it became a lot cheaper for people to independently produce their films. And also at this time, there was a big film festival market growing. Tarantino was kind of there during the early days of Sundance, and that's where he really becomes popular. That's where a lot of these videotape like directors became popular, is that they were able to send their films to these film festivals and get noticed that way. It broke down these barriers into the film industry, which were kind of resurrected during the 80s, which also ties into his 60s and 70s influences with Grindhouse.
Yeah, there's this whole, I once heard, and I can't even source this, that anything in entertainment is always cyclical to some degree. And I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think, you're pushing it maybe more like a spiral of some sort. But, because there are differences. But you're right to point that out. Tarantino was born in 1963. So let's make the argument that by the time he's 10, he's going to be cognizant of what's going on.
Well, I do remember him saying in interviews that he would take a ticket and then he would save all the ticket stubs, because they used to be colored ticket stubs for the theaters, and that he'd just save them and sneak into theaters all day.
So that makes sense. So he's really hitting Hollywood in these really interesting points.
Yeah.
And just film in general, because you have that late 60s, early 70s film tends to get sort of serious unless it's completely exploited.
Yeah, this is kind of, well, to explain this was during the era of when the studios kind of collapsed, because the U.S. government told studios they could not own movie theaters and movie production companies at the same time. And this was during a lawsuit between Paramount and the U.S. government, and the U.S. government decided that Paramount had a monopoly. So after that, theaters became independent. And in their independence, they were able to kind of buy any film they wanted. So you had all these weird guys that weren't part of the Hollywood cream of the top just making films. And a lot of times it was like just weird exploitative films. They served a very certain niche.
And you also kind of didn't know what was going to show up in any theater at that time. You really was whatever the theater management decided was going to be profitable for them. So it's a very different environment that he starts out in. He's then growing up, going into the 80s, where you get, the film brats, and they kind of take things back to like the studio picture, not necessarily in a negative way.
No, this is when Hollywood kind of figured out how to make big budget movies successful again. Because there was a big market. They were competing with like hundreds of other people all over the world. And in the 80s, with Spielberg and Lucas and all those guys, they figured out ways to make these big budget movies successful.
And it was something that I always think is fascinating. If you listen to earlier interviews with like Lucas and Spielberg, once they're successful, but not by the 90s, like I'm talking like early 80s, if you listen to a lot of interviews with them, they all say sort of the same thing, which is we made movies that were fun and accessible, which is what people weren't doing before and why you weren't getting these big hits. And they're right. But then you kind of lose the weirdness again.
With the exploitative films, you have things that were just capitalizing on weird newsline events. So there's certain things like, oh, zombie films are popular, everybody makes a zombie film. Or kung fu films are popular, everybody makes a kung fu film. Or even like gangster films, especially during this time in the 70s, there was a lot of like called blaxploitation films, which was about like gangsters that knew kung fu that beat up people. And that was like a flash in the pan, like 2-year thing. and then it just disappeared.
And I think it's interesting, too, because I think that, we're looking back, we're building back up to getting to Tarantino, I swear. But you look at the 80s, and what you see is the direct result of that is money behind concept.
Yeah.
And that's why those 80s films still hold up so well, is it was the best people working on varied concepts. By the end of the 80s, we start to lose that again.
This is where, like, I wouldn't really know where to compare it to, but, like, Hollywood films got a bit too, I wouldn't say stagnant, but they got a bit too comfortable, and they weren't really, like, making things that were gripping people anymore.
You're also getting this era of the
like,
PG-13.
Yeah.
Where Jack Valenti and the MPAA are kind of cracking down on content. And, I mean, I can tell you from being in this sort of weird generation where I was exposed as much to 80s film as I was to 90s, it was, like, palpable, the difference. Like, action movies in the 90s feel a certain way because they're, like, restrained.
For franchises that kind of bridge, like, both decades, for, like, that shows you a clear difference between, like, what the 80s were and what the 90s were, and how these massive studios treated movies as Lethal Weapon, because Lethal Weapon 1 and 2 are more violent than Lethal Weapon 3 and 4. Like, there's a very clear, like, sanitizing factor in those, like, 4 movies.
And it's funny, it took us a little while to get here, but this, I think, is where Tarantino has the biggest impact. Because Absolutely. Tarantino, in the 90s, because he's all but independently producing these films, he's able to do the type of content, like, no one's censoring film outright, so he can do the type of content he wants without the studio pressure. And not only does that allow him creative freedom, it makes all of his movies stand out because they're way more violent than anything else that's being shown.
Yeah, and that goes back again to, like, the videotape eras. Like, it was cheap to shoot these movies. It was cheap to edit these movies. You could do these pretty easily. And then you show them at film festivals. Maybe they get picked up, maybe they don't. But it was all these, like, smaller studios coming out, taking advantage of this open market going on, and screening these movies, while Hollywood was dragging its feet on all these things. And it wasn't until, like, 2004, 2003, where they really start to pick up on these things again. And even then, like, there's a lot of, like, restraint because this is, like, post 9/11 era, but that's a whole different conversation.
Now we did kind of that natural jump to 2003 that we were looking for. And in 2003, we get Kill Bill Volume 1.
Which was my first Tarantino film. And I believe, like, that's the most memorable one to me.
I think it's interesting, too. We were talking about this before we started recording. There's a fairly significant age difference between Christian and I. I'm 33.
I'm 26.
And one of the things we were talking about is, Christian's first exposure, really, to Tarantino was Kill Bill. Mine was buying DVDs of his older movies and getting excited for Kill Bill.
Yeah. That's another thing we should mention. Tarantino was very big in the DVD market because he liked putting a lot of bonus features. Bonus features are an extinct concept now. But back in, like, 2005, I liked to collect DVDs too because you heard the director, like, commentate on their movie, or, like, you saw all these behind the scenes features. And Tarantino was very diligent in always packing his stuff with behind the scenes.
Yeah, and Tarantino, later on, I'm actually pulling a little bit for something. We tend to try to immerse ourselves a little bit in our topic for the couple of days before we do these. And I was listening to an interview with Tarantino from 2012 with Charlie Rose. And he was talking about having met Terry Gilliam prior to the release of Reservoir Dogs. And he was talking to him, and I'm going to paraphrase here, obviously. And he basically asked him, how do you get these very specific visions on screen? How do you get the story that you want to tell to come across so clearly? And Gilliam basically told him the trick isn't in the director. The trick is in the director's ability to pick up all of the right people and consider all of the parts of the film. And the director's job is to then turn around and explain vividly and accurately what they're looking for. Because if you get the right people, you're going to get it every time. And I think you kind of see that when you see Tarantino's attitude towards film, like this urge to create extra content around the film, this urge to, like, make sure that all these parts are recognized.
But it was kind of like in Kill Bill where you see him really handling a bit more on his assistants and his crew, because Kill Bill is kind of famous for his choreography, his fight choreography.
It's also a massive film compared to what he was doing
Yeah.
before. I mean, maybe the only thing that has sequences that complex is From Dusk Till Dawn, and like we were saying, like that seems like that wasn't his part of the direction, if there is any direction on his part.
Yeah, and this has to do with him, like we were saying earlier, Hollywood kind of coming to Tarantino finally and giving him the budget to work with, the budget to kind of dream up these ideas.
There's definitely that shift, and that's part of the reason we paused too, is that first sort of era, maybe to 97, is Tarantino establishing himself. By the time we get to 2003, and I think that 6-year layoff helped with image, in all honesty.
Yeah.
By the time he comes back, he's a figure in himself. He's something that people are excited to see.
He became a cult figure.
So, Kill Bill Volume was a huge success. I think even more than a monetary success, I think it's a huge cultural point. Yeah. I think Kill Bill still exists in, like, the pop
it's still iconic
mentality.
Even that, like, yellow jumpsuit with Uma Thurman, that hospital scene where she's like, move my big toe. There's a lot of iconic scenes in that, and I think it's one of his better films than his other films. I'll get into later on about how I feel about his movies.
2004, we follow up with Kill Bill Volume 1 with, shockingly, Kill Bill Volume 2. Originally, they were supposed to be one film. That cut has been shown. They refer to it as The Whole Bloody Affair. Every time it gets rumored to come out on video, it doesn't happen. And it's extremely frustrating.
It probably has something to do with rights in the Weinstein Company.
Yeah, the film was split because of Harvey Weinstein, who, amongst his many notorious aspects, liked to cut films down.
Yeah, he always interfered with the films. He was kind of famous for getting indie director darlings and then kind of taking control of their films.
Yeah, that's all we're going to say about him in this podcast. But it was an interesting choice. I don't know if it benefited it. I was thinking about that pretty hard. A lot of people don't like Volume 2 very much.
Yeah, it gets kind of slow because you can kind of... Volume 1 is so tight with everything, and that's kind of what part of what Tarantino is famous for, is his tight scripts. And 2 is a little bloated because you can kind of tell he was just adding scenes here and there to extend the runtime, because I think both of them are 2.5 hours long. They're insanely long movies.
Yeah, but that Whole Bloody Affair cut has even more footage in it.
Oh, God.
So the question of whether Kill Bill would have been more balanced had it been one film that perhaps was cut down a little shorter, it's a question we'll have to ask forever. We'll never know. But regardless, there's still. I don't joke about that. We should release the Snyder cut. Regardless, I think Kill Bill in general is incredibly iconic. I'm going to make the argument that here in 2019, more iconic than Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, because Pulp Fiction has kind of been emulated to death, and Kill Bill hasn't.
And it's funny, when you talk about the emulation on Pulp Fiction, we did talk about how Tarantino sort of inspired a lot of other films.
Because it was so cheap to shoot, and like people saw that as like, I could do that in my backyard, I could do that in my warehouse, whatever.
It reminds me of something I had heard John Landis talking about on a documentary about Animal House. And how if you watch Animal House and then you look a couple of years after Animal House, there's all these movies that try to be Animal House. And some of them are good. But none of them are Animal House because you can't replicate anything. I think that whole post-Pulp Fiction deluge of kind of similar films kind of hurt Pulp Fiction ultimately.
Yeah, because there was a lot of violent revenge films afterwards, which Pulp Fiction kind of is. It's more of a collection of scenes in my mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I think Kill Bill is your revenge film, and Pulp Fiction is what it says it is. It's short stories, loosely tied.
A little later on, after the success of Kill Bill, he kind of goes back to his old friend Robert Rodriguez to make Grindhouse, which was kind of a beginning of him trying to emulate the era he saw movies in.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Grindhouse is split into 2 shorter films, both with longer cuts released eventually. The first being Planet Terror, which was Robert Rodriguez's film, a zombie film of sorts.
Yeah, a zombie action film.
And then it is followed by Death Proof, which Tarantino described, and I never thought of it this way, but I just read like a bunch of interviews on it. He describes as, it's a car film, obviously. There's a lot centered on it, but he describes it as a slasher film. And I never thought of it as that way. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? It is a slasher film.
With a car.
With a car. I love Death Proof, and people hate Death Proof.
I think I only saw it a couple times. I always remember liking Planet Terror more. I think it would have benefited if it came before Planet Terror.
I'm going to make an argument here, and I've made this argument many times over the last 12 years of my life. I like Planet Terror. No problem with it. I enjoyed Grindhouse from top to bottom when I went to see it in theaters. The trailers are fantastic. The fake trailers that they inserted with all their like director friends, just wonderful. I like Death Proof a lot because not only do I find it really entertaining, it's an actual attempt to make a Grindhouse film. Rodriguez doesn't do that. Rodriguez does, if anything, Rodriguez is making like an 80s horror movie with that. I like Tarantino's commitment to the idea that I'm going to shoot for this type of aesthetic and I'm going to get it. And I think he did. And I think part of the reason people don't like it is a lot of people don't like those movies.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I remember Death Proof being more tense because there's not a whole lot that goes on. There's a lot of like stalking.
Yeah, especially the cut that ends up the theatrical cut is not as developed. The longer cut that's available on like Blu-ray, you get a little more story. It feels a little more like a complete movie. But then again, a lot of those Grindhouse movies don't really feel like that. If you watch a lot of those older exploitation films where it's all just the blood and tits formula, as it were. But there is that sort of suddenness in Death Proof where it's like stalking thing happens. Mm. That's pretty accurate to the way those movies were cut.
I mean, this also goes back to how like Tarantino grew up in an era of like exploitative films and he just watched them over and over again. And this is where it kind of like explodes in his style, and I think he gets it mostly out of him at this point as he moves on to Inglourious Basterds.
Okay, so here we go in this. And you saw me go to Iron Man 3-face.
Yeah.
Inglourious Basterds has one of the greatest opening scenes in film.
Yeah, I guess this is where a lot of my criticisms of Tarantino come to light.
Okay, well, I want to see how we match up because we haven't talked about this off of the podcast. My problem with Inglourious Basterds is it's really long and not that much actually happens. And then at the end, when all these things are happening, it just felt cheap to me. There we go.
See, my general criticism of Tarantino is that he's a great writer for scenes, but he's not a great writer for movies. Because he makes these really strong scenes that are like really tense, and he makes these really like strong characters with like very clear motivations. You see it in the Inglourious Basterds scene when they're playing the card game. That card game scene is really cool, but has fuck all to do with the rest of the film.
Right, and it's in the middle, and it feels like it's been 5 years watching the movie at that point.
And it's a cool, really cool scene, but like it doesn't lead to anything. You can kind of tell the end is like, oh, we have the body, let's go kill Hitler now. And it just, and I think that's a recurring pattern in all of Tarantino's films. He's very good at making like scenes, and I think that's why Open Road gets shredded into several different films, because he makes like, here's a character, they come into the room, they want something, and how are they going to get it? It's a very like snappy way of writing movies, a very like Hollywood textbook way of writing movies, to be overly dismissive.
But to not be overly dismissive, we're, I think, in the minority on this. A lot of people really love Inglourious Basterds, and I get why they do. I think to perhaps frame it, he goes back to doing what he's best known for, which is, like you said, to have these scenes that have incredible tension, very character-driven, and then he throws in that grindhouse violence.
Yeah. At the end. That's usually how he caps off most scenes.
So I think a lot of people, that's what they want from him. And while I kind of wanted Death Proof more, Inglourious Basterds is probably what a lot of other people wanted. And it clearly is, because it's still incredibly well liked.
Yeah, and then it also it made Christoph Waltz a star at this point, an international star. You had a lot bigger name stars coming to his films now. He had
Mike Myers being the most famous.
Right after The Love Guru, the big hit.
He tried to save it, right? No, I love Mike Myers. Please, I've watched Wayne's World and Wayne's World 2 more than anyone should admit to.
But that's my general criticism is like they're great scenes, but they don't make very cohesive movies. And his most cohesive movie is probably Kill Bill. And even then, there's a lot of scenes where it's just like, let's just have a samurai fight now. And I think with his characters, they have clear motivations, but he doesn't really say too much with his films.
Yeah, I would agree with that, which I always thought was funny too, because if you read what he says about Natural Born Killers, is they like lost the heart. And as you were alluding to, like, okay, let's find the heart in some of these other ones too. It's interesting. I think I'm substantially more pro Tarantino than you are.
Yeah, probably.
Is the impression I've gotten. But I do see what you're saying. We're going to go back to this idea of this scenes and elements thing near the end again. But after Inglourious Basterds, which is a big success, comes 2012's Django Unchained. His highest grossing film, which a lot of people don't know.
It was also like his most critical film. I remember Spike Lee being very mad about it. And for obvious reasons we won't really get into, but there was a lot of controversy around it, and I think that helped it like become so big as well.
Tarantino does not...
He doesn't pull any punches.
He doesn't pull punches. And if he thinks a character is going to behave in a certain way, that's how he's going to write them.
He will never restrain himself. He goes all in, and I think that's what makes some of these scenes so great. There was a lot of controversy around it, especially during scenes like the skull scene with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah, and you're playing with...
He's playing with fire.
You're playing with slavery, which is the most uncomfortable American theme.
And he makes it purely into like a grindhouse film where it's just like purely like, I am going to kill every single slaver in the South. And I think that pure fantasy aspect of it makes it very cool.
I think it shows that he's still trying to make movies that are entertaining along with his themes, which is important. A lot of directors at this point in their career kind of veer off into this, I'm going to do whatever I want. And that's fine. They've earned it. I kind of like directors who still are trying to entertain you at the end of the day. And like you said, it is the most uncomfortable American theme he could possibly play with, the slavery. But he dumps it into this big Western world.
He goes so hard with like everything, and it makes it like it's kind of hard to believe it. Like it kind of puts it into its own world because of how like over the top he makes everything.
And it's also funny because it's also the first time where he kind of alludes to the fact that maybe he'd be interested in continuing some kind of franchise.
Which is strange because you would think with Kill Bill would be the first time, or even Dusk Till Dawn. I know they tried to do a Dusk Till Dawn like TV series that lasted like 6 episodes.
My understanding is he didn't have too much to do with it, though. Outside of they have to cut a check for him because he owns part of it. But that's the thing that we kind of didn't address is there's always been these rumors that Tarantino was sort of much more involved with big Hollywood productions in between things than is really talked about. Like over on Wikipedia, they're listing things like It's Pat, which I don't know if it's a massive Hollywood project. It's still a funny movie. But Crimson Tide, The Rock, these are all things that Tarantino seems like he worked on. And I remember hearing a lot of rumors in the late 90s, early 2000s about things that Tarantino had worked as a script doctor on uncredited. The one that sticks out in my mind as a rumor was X2.
I wouldn't have any doubt in my mind about that. I'm sure they scrubbed a lot of his influence from it, but I think they probably used him to establish certain scenes.
I remember hearing what it was X2 got cut by a huge amount budget-wise, and they had to cut a ton of the movie out, and I remember hearing that he was the one brought in to take what was sort of left and turn it into a movie.
Yeah, for example, that Nightcrawler scene, I could see Tarantino having a hand in it, because it's a really weird, scene that kind of comes out of nowhere. It was a really cool scene at the same time.
And this is all basically conjecture, because that was a rumor I heard when I was in high school. But that's the kind of aura that's now around that Tarantino idea. And we know for a fact that he worked on James Bond, because there was a whole thing about what he wanted to do. We know that he almost just did Star Trek. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that he's going to show up somewhere.
It also has to do with a lot of his connections he made early on. And now all his friends are in the industry. And he's kind of removed himself a bit lately. Been his kind of own monolith at this point. If you want to get something weird, you go to Tarantino. But I'm sure Tarantino has helped a lot of his friends get like things made. He had his own production company, and he's definitely had a hand with some Hollywood films. We'll probably never know which ones, but
Yeah, Nigel Dick, A Band Apart, made the Together movies for MTV.
really,
Yeah, that's the thing that's in my brain. So he gets back on this pretty consistent schedule again.
Yeah.
2015, The Hateful Eight, once again going Western, which I thought was interesting, but really well-received movie.
Yeah, I like it too. This is again where you see Tarantino's strength for scenes come through over like the movie as a whole, because you can tell it's pretty much a stage play. It's all set in one room. And this movie, when it was being made, was kind of famous for like Tarantino would just like rent out a theater and then just read the screenplay, and then he'd take feedback and fix it or whatever. But like the screenplay is like 200 pages or something.
Yeah, it's a super long movie, and now there's a cut on Netflix that I think is like almost 4 hours long. It's broken up into episodes.
Yeah.
I haven't checked that out yet because I have a job.
I watched the original cut on Netflix.
But The Hateful Eight, I mean, I agree. I think it's proof that he hasn't lost a step. I think there are cuts that could have been made to it. Not the criticism I would wage at Inglourious Basterds.
There's a lot more coherence with it overall. There's also the aspect that he shot this in 35mm, which is basically still unheard of. And that 35mm was a popular style back in the 60s and 70s to kind of like market your film as big panoramic. And I saw it in a 35mm, and it was pretty brilliant because it is absolutely like you see a lot more, because this film strip is wider. So you have a big panoramic shots, which I find funny when he's doing it like all in a room.
Yeah, but it goes back to that postmodern sort of view on film where, all those elements are part of your storytelling, where he's trying to give you this image of a type of film that basically doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And he wants you to feel that way when you're watching it. And that really brings us pretty much to 2019. In a few days, we will see the release of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
which is rumored to be his second to last film. He always keeps changing his dream film goal.
Yeah, because what? It's supposed to be 10, this is 9? Or...
Yeah, he said he even heard 12 a couple times.
Whatever he feels like, right?
He said like this is probably one of his last, because
he's going to be a Miyazaki. just every time he retires, he's back.
Miyazaki says that so many times. It's frustrating.
He's the Terry Funk of filmmaking. So we don't know a ton about this because neither of us have seen it.
No, I'm sure there's a lot of like, if you lived in LA, you probably heard a lot of stuff about it already.
We do know we're getting the Bowling sisters of Troma fame as members of the Manson family, which in itself is pretty intriguing. But we don't really know much about this. So I think what we can end on is kind of, we've been referring to this aesthetic almost this entire podcast, and we haven't really defined it. I'm going to go back to that interview from 2012 with Charlie Rose, because Tarantino said something that I thought was extremely interesting. He was pretty much directly asked what his aesthetic is. And he kind of, if you ever listen to Tarantino talk, it's like this endless stream of consciousness just flowing from his mouth.
It's a very LA personality, which I think why he was able to get so many connections early on. He just talks all the time.
He's a good pitch man.
He's a good pitcher. He's good in a room.
He referred to it almost in passing as a hip-hop aesthetic. And he's not referring to like an urban aesthetic, because that's obviously not true when you get to like Inglourious Basterds, Django Unchained. There's certainly an argument for that in, Jackie Brown, Natural Born Killers, True Romance, Reservoir Dogs. There's sort of like an urbanness to them. What he meant by it, and he'd explained this, and I think he has a pretty good view of himself, is he sees film as all these pieces, and he sees one thing. He sees a musician here, and he sees a scene here, and he sees an actor here. And what he tries to do is take all those elements and make something new, like you would when you were remixing, a beat for a hip-hop record. Okay. That's his analogy for it, and I think that's fairly accurate. I think that's what he does. He looks at things, tries to figure out how they work and why they work, and then he puts them together.
Yeah, even Tarantino's opinion that he does hip-hop aesthetic is pretty indicative of him as a person. Like, I don't disagree with it, but it's also like, come on, Tarantino.
No, I thought it was a good analogy.
It's a good analogy, but it's also like pretty indicative of his personality.
But like you said, he's Put in a room. He's going to talk your ear off. He's going to know everything about everything.
Well, like, the pieces themselves are great. And that's, like, something throughout all these films. Like, he makes... Every one of these movies has, like, some memorable scene from it. But I don't know if you can really, like, come up with, like, a log line for any of these. Which isn't a problem. I'm kind of anti-log line myself, but...
Right, and I would agree with that. But I think it's successful most of the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. His work is defining. Incredibly defining in the 90s.
And I think that's what led to, him becoming the icon, even sort of over his movies.
Because if you look at people like that came out around this era too, like Kevin Smith and things like that, they haven't aged as well. But Tarantino has. And I think like if after all this like streaming services stuff like somehow collapses or like all these companies stop trying to control everything again, like you'll probably see a lot of people that were really influenced by Tarantino popping up again.
What is interesting is a lot of the directors who were his contemporaries also became more themselves than their films. Kevin Smith is a huge example of that. Kevin Smith now markets Kevin Smith. Jim Jarmusch, that's Roth. Two people go. Eli Roth is like on the edge though, right? He's kind of like... He's in Inglourious Basterds. But he's half like... his movies. I always feel like... And this is going to sound like an insult to Eli Roth, even though I don't universally hate his films. Eli Roth always feels like Tarantino's little buddy. Here he is. Like Paul Rodriguez felt like Tarantino's best friend. Yeah. They're buddies. Like Eli Roth is like, hey, Tarantino gave me money to make another movie.
Here's Hostel 3. Here's Hostel 4.
I like Hostel 1 and 2.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying, like, I think Eli Roth has one movie in him, and that's Hostel.
Green Inferno's okay. Next time we'll do Eli Roth. We're not going to do Eli Roth next time. Maybe in a decade.
We could probably do Robert Rodriguez.
We could do Rodriguez.
Bizarre.
That's another guy. Rodriguez is the opposite of Tarantino. Tarantino is like... He's working on things and not telling you anything. Yeah. And Rodriguez is like, here's 100 movies that'll never come out.
Yeah. Also, like, Tarantino's less into, like, making big movies than Rodriguez is. Rodriguez loves making these huge, multi-billion-dollar movies that always flop.
Well, anyway, we effectively got off track. So we'll call it quits on this one. We think we pretty much got through everything we wanted to with Tarantino. We're both interested in seeing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Surprisingly sparse career over 2 decades.
Yeah, but I think quality over quantity, even if in fleeting moments by your argument. If you would, we would really like it if you shared and liked and commented, followed, subscribed.
Hit that bell button.
Hit the bell. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you got the
bell. The bell's the new one. I've been listening to other people's podcasts. Yes, because you want to know when our new stuff goes up so you can watch it. So hit that bell so you get some alerts. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Vero, which I love to talk about.
You and Scott Snyder.
Not Scott, Zack Snyder. Scott Snyder probably has a Vero too. I don't know. We can ask him. But thanks for joining us again. Once again, I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And this was the Dissecting Fiction Podcast.